Imagine waking up to a world where the balance of power in the Middle East is no longer dictated by the familiar players, where the old certainties Israel's military dominance, American diplomatic leverage, and the Gulf's financial muscle are suddenly being challenged by a nation that, for decades, was dismissed as a regional bystander. That world is no longer hypothetical. It's unfolding right now, and the epicenter of this seismic shift is Turkey. For Israel, this is not just a strategic headache, it's a nightmare scenario that is rapidly becoming reality. Let's set the stage with a simple, undeniable fact. Turkey is no longer content to play second fiddle in its own neighborhood. For years, Ankara's ambitions were constrained by economic instability, political infighting, and a sense of strategic caution. But those days are over. Today, Turkey is leveraging its geography, its growing economic clout, and a newly assertive foreign policy to redraw the map of influence from the Mediterranean to the Caucasus, from North Africa to the Persian Gulf. And nowhere is this more consequential than for Israel, which now finds itself facing a rival with the resources, the will, and the legitimacy to upend the regional order. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers are the bedrock of power. In 2025, Turkey's nominal GDP stands at $1.3 trillion, a figure that, while modest compared to the economic giants of the world, is more impressive when you consider the trajectory. Despite global economic headwinds, Turkey posted a 4.8% year-on-year growth rate in the second quarter of 2025. That's not just good, it's exceptional, especially in a world where most economies are struggling to keep their heads above water. Even more telling is the 1.6% quarter-on-quarter growth, the highest in 2 years. This is not the performance of a country in crisis. This is the performance of a country on the move. But what's truly remarkable is that this growth is happening in the face of tight monetary conditions. Inflation, which peaked at a staggering 85% in late 2022, has been brought down to around 42% by early 2025. Still high, yes, but the direction is what matters. Under the stewardship of Finance Minister Mehmet Imsek, Turkey has returned to orthodox economic management, restoring credibility and attracting investment. Private consumption is booming, investment is up nearly 9% year-on-year, and construction is surging. The World Bank has revised its growth forecast for Turkey upward, and the OECD projects that Turkey will remain one of the fastest growing economies in its group over the next decade. Why does this matter? Because economic power is the foundation of strategic autonomy. Money buys weapons, influence, and perhaps most importantly, time. And nowhere is Turkey's economic transformation more visible than in its defense sector. In 2024, Turkish defense exports hit $7.1 billion, a 29% increase year-on-year, reaching 180 countries. That's not just a statistic, that's a global network of influence. The total value of defense projects exceeds $100 billion, with annual revenues at $16 billion and over 3,500 companies in the sector. Research and development spending is now over $2.8 billion a year. Consider Baykar, the family-owned drone manufacturer led by President Erdoğan's son-in-law, Selçuk Bayraktar. Baykar now controls 60% of the global UAV export market, and Turkey as a whole commands 65%. The Bayraktar TB2 drone has been sold to 34 countries, and the larger Akinsai drone to 10. These systems have proven themselves in real combat, from Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh, from Ukraine to Syria. When your weapons work on the battlefield, your order book fills up. And Turkey isn't stopping at drones. It's building main battle tanks, fifth-generation fighter jets, stealth drones, hypersonic missiles, and advanced air defense systems. The TCG Anadolu, Turkey's new amphibious assault ship, is set to become the centerpiece of Turkish power projection in the Mediterranean. What's the secret? Strategic autonomy through industrial policy. When the US refused to sell Predator drones, Turkey built its own. When it was blocked from the F-35 program after buying Russian S-400s, it doubled down on its indigenous fighter jet. Every embargo, every sanction, every restriction has been met with innovation and self-reliance. This is import substitution that works because it's export-oriented from the start. Turkey isn't just building weapons for itself, it's building them for a world hungry for alternatives to American, Russian, or Chinese systems. Nowhere is this new Turkish assertiveness more visible than in Syria. When Bashar al-Assad's regime collapsed in December 2024, Turkey was the best positioned external actor to shape the future. Years of investment in Syrian opposition groups, humanitarian aid to millions of refugees, and a sustained military presence gave Ankara leverage no other power could match. Today, Turkey has 20-0 troops in Syria, a defense agreement with the new Damascus government, and is training Syrian forces. Turkish exports to Syria have surged 54% year-on-year, and Turkish goods now dominate Syrian markets, often undercutting local prices by 30–40%. Turkish companies are aggressively pursuing Syria's $400 billion reconstruction market, and a new natural gas pipeline is channeling Azerbaijani gas into Syria. This is economic statecraft at scale. Every road, every power plant, every factory built by Turkish firms creates interests that must be protected, by force if necessary. This justifies a continued military presence, which in turn enables political influence. For Israel, this is deeply alarming. Turkey is now Syria's primary strategic partner, with the ability to project air power across the Levant and complicate Israeli freedom of action. Turkish training and equipment could eventually create a capable military on Israel's northeastern border, aligned with Ankara. But Turkey's ambitions don't stop at Syria. In Libya, Turkey is engaging with both factions, pursuing maritime agreements that would extend its claims in the eastern Mediterranean, directly challenging Greek and Cypriot economic zones. In Somalia, Turkey has military bases, is training local forces, and investing in port infrastructure, giving it access to the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa critical choke points for global trade. The reopening of the Iraq-Turkey pipeline positions Ankara as an energy transit hub, connecting Asia to Europe and giving it leverage over regional energy markets. The implications of Turkey's rise are not lost on Israel's strategic planners. For decades, Israel has enjoyed a unique position in the region, militarily superior, diplomatically agile, and economically resilient. But the emergence of Turkey as a regional hegemon is rewriting the rules of the game. This is not a return to the old Ottoman, Israeli rivalry. It is something far more complex and, for Israel, far more dangerous. Turkey is not just another adversary. It is a NATO member, a major trading partner with Europe, and a country whose influence is expanding not through isolation, but through integration. Let's examine the diplomatic dimension. In November 2024, Turkey severed all relations with Israel. By the following year, Turkish prosecutors had issued arrest warrants for 37 Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF Chief of Staff, accusing them of genocide and crimes against humanity. This is not mere rhetoric. These are legal instruments that complicate international travel for Israeli leaders and signal a willingness to use every tool of statecraft, legal, economic, and military, to constrain Israel's options. President Erdogan's public statements have become increasingly incendiary, calling for Israel's destruction and refusing to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. Hamas maintains an office in Istanbul, and Turkish intelligence has warned Israel against targeting Hamas members on Turkish soil. Contrast this with Iran, Israel's traditional nemesis. Iran is isolated, sanctioned, and its economy is structurally weak. Turkey, by contrast, is deeply integrated into global supply chains, a major trade partner with Europe, and a key player in NATO. Sanctioning Turkey is not as simple as sanctioning Iran. The economic blowback would be far more severe, not just for Israel, but for the entire Western alliance. Turkey's defense exports reach 180 countries, many of which are also Israeli diplomatic partners. Its dominance in the global drone market means dozens of militaries are now dependent on Turkish technology, spare parts, and training. This creates a web of interests that Ankara can leverage in capitals around the world. The Syrian theater is particularly acute. For years, Israel enjoyed near-total freedom of action in Syrian airspace, striking Iranian positions, Hezbollah convoys, and weapons transfers at will. But as Syria aligned with Turkey, equipped with Turkish air defense systems and hosting Turkish air bases, fundamentally changes that calculation. Israeli military planners must now consider the risk of striking Turkish equipment or personnel, potentially triggering a confrontation with a NATO member that boasts the ninth largest military in the world. This is a far cry from the days of striking at Assad's degraded forces or Iranian proxies with impunity. Turkey's involvement in Gaza ceasefire negotiations is another sign of its growing influence. Ankara helped pressure Hamas to accept international peace plans and has offered to participate in stabilization forces for Gaza. While Israel has rejected Turkish participation, the very fact that it is being discussed shows how much the regional landscape has shifted. Imagine Turkish forces in Gaza as peacekeepers, Turkish bases in Syria, and a Turkish naval presence expanding in the eastern Mediterranean. For Israel, this is not just encirclement. It is encirclement by a regional power that views Hamas as legitimate resistance, calls Israeli actions genocide, and has issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. Economic warfare is another front where Turkey's tools are underappreciated. While Ankara has not imposed formal sanctions on Israel, recognizing its own economic vulnerabilities, it has found subtler ways to exert pressure. Turkish officials claim to have suspended trade with Israel since 2023, though independent reporting suggests the reality is more nuanced, a significant reduction in bilateral trade, but not a complete cessation. More important is Turkey's ability to influence regional trade flows. If Turkish companies dominate Syrian reconstruction, they can exclude Israeli firms. If Turkey controls pipeline routes from Iraq, it can shape regional energy markets. If Turkish ports become primary Mediterranean hubs, they can affect shipping routes and costs. The defense sector is a particularly sharp point of competition. Historically, Israel has been the dominant Middle Eastern defense exporter, accounting for over half of the region's exports between 2020 and 2024. But Turkey is closing the gap rapidly. Turkish drones are cheaper, proven in combat, and come with fewer political strings than American weapons, but are more capable than Chinese alternatives. Every Turkish defense contract is a potential Israeli contract lost. Every country operating Turkish drones is a country less dependent on Israeli technology. This is not just a battle for market share, it is a battle for strategic influence. Yet, for all its strengths, Turkey's ascent is not without vulnerabilities. Inflation, while down from its peak, remains crippling for ordinary Turks. The lira has collapsed, real wages have been eroded, and capital flight is a persistent concern. Foreign currency reserves, though improving, are still not robust relative to the size of the economy. Politically, Erdogan's grip on power is strong but not unassailable. He is 71, with health concerns that occasionally surface, and his party has lost control of major cities in recent elections. The opposition is fragmented, but any political transition could be destabilizing, especially given how personalized Turkish foreign policy has become. Energy dependency is another Achilles heel. Turkey imports nearly all its oil and gas, making it vulnerable to price shocks and supply disruptions. Past exemptions from sanctions on Russian gas and Iranian oil may not continue, especially if U.S. policy shifts. The contradiction between Turkey's regional ambitions and its NATO membership also creates strategic uncertainty. Ankara's acquisition of Russian S-400 systems led to its exclusion from the F-35 program, and further weapons embargoes are possible. The more Turkey's ambitions diverge from those of its Western allies, the greater the risk of isolation or punitive measures. Military overextension is a real risk. Turkey has troops deployed in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Qatar, Somalia, and Cyprus. It faces an ongoing insurgency from Kurdish groups and persistent tensions with Greece. Its defense projects are ambitious and expensive, and 20,000 troops in Syria alone is a significant commitment. Any setback in these deployments could undermine Turkey's entire strategic position. The Gaza war has been central to Turkey's regional resurgence. For years, Ankara tried to balance its relationships with Israel, the Arab world, and the West. 2010 Gaza flotilla incident damaged relations, but they recovered. By 2022, Turkey and Israel had restored full diplomatic ties, but the events of October 7, 2023, Hamas's attack and Israel's response forced a binary choice. Erdoğan chose to position Turkey as the champion of the Palestinians and the fiercest critic of Israeli actions. This was not just moral outrage, it was a calculated strategic move. By taking the strongest pro-Palestinian position of any major regional power, Turkey differentiated itself from the Gulf states that had normalized relations with Israel. Ankara became the voice of the Arab street, a role that Arab leaders were unwilling or unable to play. This positioning has paid dividends. Turkey is now central to ceasefire negotiations, discussed as a potential peacekeeper, and has restored its relevance in Arab capitals that had previously distanced themselves from Ankara's Islamist foreign policy. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation now views Turkey as genuinely committed to Palestinian rights, in contrast to the quiet cooperation between Arab governments and Israel. Gaza has been a catalyst for Turkish influence, restoring its soft power across the Muslim world and giving Erdoğan a cause that resonates domestically, distracting from economic difficulties and positioning Turkey as a moral leader. To truly grasp why Turkey's ascent is Israel's worst nightmare, we must look beyond the headlines and into the deeper structures of legitimacy, power, and perception. Iran, for all its bluster and direct threats, is a known quantity, an adversary that Israel and the West have spent decades containing, sanctioning, and, when necessary, striking. Turkey, on the other hand, is a shifter, a NATO ally, a trading partner, a Muslim, majority democracy with a secular tradition, and now a self-declared champion of the Palestinian cause. This ambiguity is what makes Turkey's rise so dangerous for Israel. It is not a pariah to be isolated, it is a problem to be managed, and the tools for management are far more limited. Consider the contrast. Iran's threat to Israel is direct and existential. Nuclear weapons development, proxy forces on multiple borders, explicit calls for Israel's destruction. And actual missile attacks, Turkey's threat is more insidious. It is embedded in international legitimacy, economic integration, and diplomatic maneuvering. Turkey is not building nuclear weapons or firing missiles at Israel. Instead, it is building influence, capability, and presence in ways that constrain Israeli strategic freedom without triggering the red lines that Iranian actions do. Turkey can establish military bases in Syria and call it stabilization. It can arm Hamas politically and frame it as support for legitimate resistance. It can issue arrest warrants for Israeli officials and present it as a defense of international law. The world may not agree, but it cannot simply dismiss Turkey as it does Iran. The American role in this drama is fraught with contradictions. The United States needs Turkey as a NATO ally, a bulwark against Russian expansion, and a gatekeeper of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Incirlik Air Base remains a critical asset for U.S. and NATO operations, yet Turkey's actions increasingly run counter to American interests and those of its closest Middle Eastern ally, Israel. Ankara hosts Hamas, issues arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, buys Russian weapon systems, and threatens fellow NATO member Greece. The U.S. response has been to try to have it both ways, maintain Turkey in NATO while attempting to constrain its regional ambitions. But this balancing act is becoming increasingly untenable. Every Turkish advance in Syria is a challenge to American partners. Every Turkish drone sold, is a potential loss for American defense contractors. Every Turkish critique of Israel is a diplomatic headache in Washington. The Trump administration's approach has been transactional, praising Turkey's role in Gaza's ceasefire negotiations, trying to moderate Turkish Israeli tensions through personal diplomacy with Erdoğan, and avoiding any moves that might push Turkey further into the arms of Russia or China. But these are short-term fixes. The underlying trajectory is clear. Turkey is moving toward regional hegemony, and that trajectory will eventually collide with American commitments to Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. The economic dimension of this rivalry cannot be overstated. American companies want access to Turkish markets, and Turkey is pursuing major infrastructure projects that attract global investment. But American defense contractors are increasingly hurt by Turkish competition, and policymakers are frustrated by Ankara's willingness to buy Russian systems and challenge Western norms. The contradictions are mounting, and the room for compromise is shrinking. So where does this all lead? Let's consider 4 plausible scenarios, each rooted in the economic and strategic fundamentals we've discussed. Scenario 1. Managed competition. This is the optimistic case. Turkey and Israel recognize that they are locked in a long-term competition, but avoid direct confrontation. The United States plays mediator, keeping Turkish forces in northern Syria away from Israeli areas of operation, and ensuring that Turkish peacekeepers are kept out of Gaza. Economic engagement continues despite political tensions, and both sides show a degree of restraint that has been lacking in recent years. This scenario requires a level of pragmatism and self-control that, given current leadership dynamics, seems unlikely but not impossible. Scenario 2. Escalating friction. This is in many ways the most likely outcome. Turkish and Israeli interests continue to clash in Syria, Gaza, Libya, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Proxy conflicts emerge, with Turkish weapons ending up in the hands of groups fighting Israel, and Israeli intelligence operations targeting Turkish assets. The relationship spirals downward, with mounting costs for both sides and an ever-present risk of miscalculation. This is a slow burn conflict, one that saps resources, attention, and diplomatic capital from both Ankara and Jerusalem. Scenario 3. Direct confrontation. This is the nightmare scenario, but it is not beyond the realm of possibility. An Israeli strike in Syria hits Turkish personnel or equipment, or Turkey shoots down an Israeli aircraft over Syrian airspace. Israeli covert operations in Turkey targeting Hamas leaders are discovered, and Turkish citizens are killed. Once direct kinetic engagement occurs between Turkish and Israeli forces, escalation dynamics become very difficult to control. NATO's Article 5 looms in the background, creating a layer of complexity that could draw in the United States and other alliance members. The risk of a wider regional war cannot be discounted. Scenario 4. Strategic accommodation. This is the least likely but perhaps the most interesting scenario. Turkey and Israel, recognizing that endless confrontation serves neither's interests, find a modus vivendi. Turkey moderates its rhetoric and constrains Hamas's activities, while Israel accepts a limited Turkish presence in Syria as long as it does not directly threaten Israeli security. Trade resumes, diplomatic channels reopen, and both sides focus on areas of mutual benefit. This would require both Erdoğan and Netanyahu to make politically difficult choices, and for now, domestic incentives in both countries point in the opposite direction. What is clear is that the old order is gone. Turkey's ascent is not a temporary phenomenon or a passing phase. It is the result of deliberate choices, strategic investments, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. For Israel, this means adapting to a new reality in which its freedom of action is constrained not just by hostile neighbors, but by a regional power with global connections, economic leverage, and a growing sense of mission. The contrast could not be starker. Where Israel once faced adversaries that could be isolated, sanctioned, or deterred, it now faces a rival that is integrated, legitimate, and increasingly indispensable to the functioning of the region. Where Israel once enjoyed uncontested dominance in the skies over Syria, it now must weigh every strike against the risk of hitting Turkish assets. Where Israel once relied on American diplomatic cover, it now finds Washington torn between competing alliances and interests. Turkey's rise is not just Israel's nightmare. It is a challenge to the entire architecture of Middle Eastern security. It is a test of American resolve, European unity, and the ability of regional actors to adapt to a world in which power is more diffuse, legitimacy more contested, and the old certainties no longer apply. The coming years will be defined by how Israel, Turkey, and their allies navigate this new landscape, one in which the only constant is change and the only certainty is uncertainty.